had lost her sight and was practically an invalid. And Penny and Sister was taking care of Mama and Irene. You were in Gainesville with her when I went to New York, and I stayed there for several years until
Mama became
my
ill.
mother had a heart attack. And at that time I decided I would go home for good because, Mr. Excelsior's health was failing and he was having problems too. So I went back to New Smyrna, and that's when I went to work for my nephew, Forrest Jr. in the auto parts business.
That's when you came down to West Palm Beach, though. Weren't you in West Palm Beach when you worked for Forrest in the auto business?
No, wait a minute. At that time, now let me see, you were married and living in Gainesville.
But you came back when Mama was ill, weren't you?
Yes, I did.
And died. And then you went back to New York?
No, I didn't.
No.
I went back to work for Forrest.
Okay, so then you went to West Palm Beach to work for Forrest.
That's right. And when I went to West Palm Beach, Richard, in the meantime, had stopped school and gone to work for the Florida Highway Patrol, and they stationed him, they transferred him to West Palm Beach, so that when they came to West Palm Beach, I went to live with them. And you all bought a little home up on Gramercy Park, you remember that?
Yes, I do.
And I lived with you there while I was working with
Forrest Jr.
Forrest Jr. And that was a happy occasion because you and Richard were both going to school, college, and I was able to help you take care of the children. Meantime, you had another
baby. You had Burton.
You had Burton. And so things were going really nice. And you were going to school, Richard was going to school, Dites, and
you met someone.
Huh?
You met
and then Charles came back into my life.
Well, tell us about Charles and what happened there.
Well, he had worked for Chrysler Corporation ever since he left Hopkinsville. And for 40 years he had been with them.
And this was an old flame, right?
Yeah, right.
From Hopkinsville.
That's right, from Hopkinsville. And he had he'd lost his wife, who was ill for 4 years before she died with what they call Lou Gehrig's disease. And he was kind of at loose ends, and he came over to see me, and we began seeing each other, and ultimately married in 1969.
And how old were the two of you when you got married?
Both of us were 64 years old.
64.
Because his birthday was just in June, mine was in September. And Penny, I remember how nice you were to give us so many parties during the time we were going through our courting stage.
And did you have a big wedding?
We had a very lovely wedding at my church. Now, Charles had been married before, but he'd never been married in a church. But there were a lot of parties given for us, and that was the First Methodist Church. And they gave us some big parties, too. And after we were married, we went back briefly to
Hopkinsville?
To Detroit.
Detroit, okay.
Charles had a condominium there, and we lived in that for one summer, and then came back to Florida, and took an apartment in Northern Park Towers on Flagler Drive.
Did you have some nice trips when you were married?
We took a trip about a year later. We took a trip to Europe. Then we went by ship to Naples, and from Naples we took a bus tour It took us through about 8 countries. We went to Italy and France and Germany and England and Scotland, and then back to Naples, where we took the ship home. That was a trip of about three weeks.
Do you have a favorite country that you saw?
Oh, they were all
Enjoy?
favorite. We were so thrilled. Charles hadn't been abroad, and neither had I. And so it was all new to us, and we really made some wonderful friends on the trip. And,
You told me a story about when you were visiting some museums and the questions that you would ask when you were touring, and who they thought you might be. Do you remember that story
no,
you
I
told
don't know
me?
what you're talking about. Well,
You said in some of the museums, I don't remember which, maybe in England, that you were visiting, and they wanted to know because you read a lot, and you've read a lot about
I
England.
think it was probably from my reading that I was familiar with stories about Mary Queen of Scots, and those were, because I've always been really fond of historical novels, and she is one of my favorites. I guess they maybe attracted a little, maybe I had a little fun that way with them.
Yeah, I recall you saying they thought maybe you were a college professor. Because
Oh,
you asked such intelligent questions.
anything but.
Tell me about some other trips that you had.
Well, we did, Charles and I moved to Boynton Beach from the place in Norton. While we lived at North Park Towers, we had a really nice life going to the theater because it was right across the way from Palm Beach, and that was nice. But there was some talk of our apartment being converted into a condominium, and we didn't want that. So we moved to a villa in Boynton Beach, and
Which you purchased?
we
Purchased the villa.
purchased the villa in Boynton Beach. By that time, I think you were living probably in where were you living?
It was Palmar Drive or
Yeah, I think
or Lake Clark Shores.
Lake Clark Shores. And Charles, after we got back from our trip to Europe, what did we do for fun?
You went to one of the things I believe that you went to Kentucky to a reunion.
Well, we made several trips back to Michigan
To Michigan.
during that time. But right after we were married,
His aunt passed away.
he had a cousin,
A cousin.
Anna Green, passed away, and he named Charles. She named Charles in her will for half of her estate with another cousin. So we were able to buy this place, that gave us a financial boost that we were able to buy this home and pay cash for it in Boynton Beach. Charles began to, his health began to fail though, and he had a heart problem. His breathing was bad, so we couldn't do very much traveling. We would have liked to do some more foreign traveling, but he wasn't able to do it. And so we lived a kind of a quiet life there. After moving into it in '79, during the '80s, we just sort of lived a quiet life there, going occasionally back to Detroit to visit with his friends and relatives up there.
And you also visited Kentucky several times, though, I think.
Kentucky?
Mhm. I think you went to a reunion.
Oh yes, we did. During that time, my brother S.T. was living on a big house in
Plantation.
in Milton, Kentucky, and we went there for a wonderful trip where the family gathered for a big reunion. But Charles' health gradually failed, and he died in '89. And after his death, I did quite a bit of traveling.
What about a trip that you and I
You
took
remember
together?
going to England and that
Yes.
wonderful week we had there, seeing shows and going to all the famous places there. And then another trip we took was with Helen, my other friend from Detroit. With you and Richard, we went to the Greek
Greek
to
island.
Athens and to the Greek island, touring the Greek island. And then Helen, who had lost her husband, was free to travel. And we did a Caribbean cruise. I went to the islands and to Mexico. And then we went on a trip to Hawaii. And there we visited with my niece Carol and her husband Bob. And but Helen, who said she never was going to get married again, did. And that ended our trips together at that time. And we were back.
Helen did come down to see you, flew down one time.
Sure.
Tell me about her flight that Helen took with her new husband.
Oh, he was an aviator, and he came down in his own plane to visit us. And while he was here, he took us to, and Burton went with us on that trip to Key West. And Burton had been to Key West many times and was very familiar with it. So he was a wonderful guide on that trip we took down there. And we took some nice pictures. That was a nice trip.
This was on his plane.
On his own?
How many seats were in it?
What?
Oh, no, there was
a driver. There were four. I guess there were four of us in the plane when we went down. And but it was a wonderful trip.
I remember Helen telling me about the first trip that she made with him, and she told me she took some chocolates with her on the plane to nibble on during the trip, and she didn't realize how warm it was going to get, and they all melted.
Well, he gave. Well, they were married, and were living in the Henry Ford homes up there. Very nice. I had visited Helen there before, and but that ended our trips together. Now,
tell me about any other. Do you have some? Did Charles have some relatives that you became very close with, and still are?
well, yes. Charles's first wife had a daughter.
A niece.
Joy.
A niece, not a daughter. A niece.
That's right. That's right. It was her sister who had the child. And Joy and her husband had, when I married Charles, really adopted me and made me as near a member of the family as you could consider. And we are very close to each other this day. But after the next thing that happened was I started getting old. And
Tell me about what you did with Charles gone, beside taking some trips. What did you do in the neighborhood?
I played a lot of bridge, and I met a lot of lovely ladies. And we played bridge 4 or 5 times a week. And that was my main sport at that time. But as I say, I was getting old, and I was approaching my 100th birthday.
What